Last week, I hope a lot of you were there because we had an incredible service with the spiritual journey of Tamara Oman. She's a member at the Open Circle Fellowship in Fond du Lac. And she shared this very, very powerful spiritual journey. And if you weren't there, I'll give you a few of the highlights now. She talked about how the circumstances of her life and choices, she had basically ended up living a pure living hell, if you will. A major source of the hell, she repeated over and over again, was a sheer lack of love in her life. There was a lack of self-love because she said everyone except her mom, and she said, well, moms are supposed to love their kids. Everyone but her mom seemed to be telling her that she wasn't worthy of love. And then finally, after finding herself incarcerated as a young adult, she made a crucial decision to live and then turned to a Christian spirituality to help pull her through it. Along her life's journey, she said that she came to this spirituality a little bit unwillingly because of her life's journey and the experiences she had had with churches along the way. There were a number of churches, she said, that told her that she basically didn't belong because she didn't fit in. Or she gave one example of she was welcomed heartily and warmly on Sunday morning and then kind of cursed at by the same person midweek at a softball game. So she thought the people didn't live up to what they were supposed to be doing. But then she eventually found and embraced the ultimate message of Jesus of Nazareth, love, to love yourself and others above all else. Now, what Tamara basically discovered and embraced is a doctrine of universal salvation. It's a belief that the point of Jesus's life and teachings were to provide the very best example possible of how to live in a community with others focused on love, acceptance, and celebration of the breadth and depth of humanity. It's a belief stressing that if we live with the ideals of Jesus in mind, we don't need to be threatened with hell or eternal suffering to do the right thing. That was the point of the Hosea Ballew's story on the horseback with the Baptist preacher. That's the essence of universalism. At the individual level, universalism states that everyone is saved and has the potential in this life, has great potential in this life. In other words, we do not believe in original sin, the idea that everybody's born already sinful and evil from birth. Or said another way, we believe in the inherent worth and dignity of everyone right from the beginning. You don't have to prove it or earn it. Now, at the community level, universalism stresses the goal of living in beloved community, living in relationship with others such that retribution or the threat of hell is not necessary. So the founding of universalism, just like these legend stories that I just told you about Hosea Ballew, also comes with its own legend story. And I want to share that with you because I'm quite sure it's true, but it makes me chuckle every time. So John Murray was the founder of Universalism in America. So this story starts in England in 1770. So prior to the Revolutionary War in this country, John Murray was living in England and he was depressed and a broken man. And then through his reading of the scripture on his own, he arrived at a universalist theology, basically that there's universal salvation. And then he embarked on a career as a minister, but few people wanted to hear that back then. It was very much dominated with this Calvinist theology of everybody's going to burn in hell and only a few people are going to be elected to go to heaven at the end. So he seemed kind of like a radical and people weren't interested in what he had to say. And then on top of that, his wife died and he had to serve a short time in debtor's jail because he couldn't pay for her medical doctor bills. So when he got released out of jail, he's like, okay, this is enough. I'm going to America and I'm never going to preach again. And we're just going to find something to do over there. But fate, or as Murray would later say it, divine providence intervened. The ship in which he set sail ran aground on a sandbar off the coast of New Jersey. So not wanting to lose a crew member if the ship broke loose again and had to sail off, they made Murray go ashore to see if they could figure out what was going on. So there Murray stumbled on this guy named Thomas Potter. He was well-to-do, but an illiterate farmer who himself had arrived at a Universalist theology about 20 years more before that. Potter, of course, this is what you do when you discover new theology, right? You build a chapel. So he built a chapel on his property, and it had been there for about 20 years, and he'd been waiting for a preacher to arrive and preach universalism there. So as you have it, seeing Murray as the man he had long been waiting for, he prevailed upon the new arrival to preach the following Sunday, it then being Friday. Reluctantly, Murray agreed, providing that the ship did not break loose before Sunday. And then he paced and paced the floor, hoping the ship would break loose. He must have kept looking out the window over and over again, quoting to himself, "I don't want to preach. I promised I would never preach again." Saturday afternoon, the ship was still there. So he decided to prepare a few remarks. He still hoped the ship would break loose, of course, but on Sunday morning, it was still aground. And so he did preach, and the experience changed his life. From then on, he preached universalism, and a few years later, he founded the first Universalist church in North America in Gloucester, Massachusetts. And from his first reluctant sermon, universalism grew until at its height in the late 19th century, it was the 6th largest denomination in the country. Hosea Ballou was one of Universalism's so that was John Murray, the founder of it. And then Hosea Ballou was one of Universalism's most famous preacher and evangelists in New England. And so there's a lot written about him on his horseback, going all through New England and founding congregations. So one thing you probably should know, New England at the time was dominated by Unitarians and Universalists, and then to some degree, the Church of England. And the Unitarians were the highly educated, super wealthy. They owned all the cotton mills and that kind of thing, Harvard Divinity School, that kind of thing. And the Universalists tended to be the workers that were newly immigrant or came off the farm and were beginning to work in those mills. So we have this history in our theology where it was two different classes, socioeconomic classes, that eventually came together in the 1960s to form the Unitarian Universalist Association. Another side note, there was one exception, the First Universalist Church of Wausau, where I did my internship. It started as a Universalist congregation, and today their name is First Universalist Unitarian Church of Wausau, to make sure that everybody knows that. It turns out that was somebody who immigrated from New England to Wausau, became a lumber baron, one of the wealthiest people in the state, built the church. They never had a mortgage. So it ended up being one of the wealthiest congregations in Universalism at the time, and actually sent a lot of delegates to the national office. So just a little bit of Wisconsin lore. Then there was Olympia Brown. I'm sure you've heard of Olympia Brown. She's very famous, suffragette. But maybe what you didn't know is that in July 25th, 1863, we're talking 19th century, folks, she became the first ordained woman in America from an established denomination. Now, this is also kind of hilarious because there was a lot of sexism. The old men in New England, didn't really like us out here on the frontier in Wisconsin and Illinois and Iowa. And there was a group of women who had become strong clergy and leaders. Look up the book, it's the Iowa Sisterhood. It's a fascinating read. They thought the women were a bunch of upstarts and really didn't want to, do them any favors. So when Olympia Brown was ordained, they gave her this church that they thought was going to die in Racine, Wisconsin. And it turns out she grew it, and it was gangbusters, and now it's named Olympia Brown Unitarian Universalist Church, and it's a very thriving congregation. In fact, there's 2 members of Open Circle who used to belong there. So a little more trivia. So that's kind of the history of Universalism. Now, this summer, when I was on study leave, a member of Open Circle actually lent me her book called Stealing Jesus by Bruce Boyer. This book was also written in the late 90s, and I had never read it, but I'd heard about it before, and I found it fascinating, and it kind of ties into what we have today. So basically, it's a story about where did the Christian right come from and how did they become a political movement. And I think he starts at the very beginning and he says those Puritans, those pilgrims that came off the boat, which are our theological ancestors, the Unitarian side, were very Calvinist. They thought they were coming to this country. They had been given it by God, the land,